Bonjour and good afternoon. I would like to give you a warm welcome also on behalf of the Friedrich Ebert Foundation to all of you who will join us here in the rooms of the OFCE, but also the participants that will join us via online transmission. In particular, welcome, of course, to our guests from abroad, from Italy, Andrea Morterni, who has participated also in the yet mentioned debate we had on fiscal rules in Europe. Thanks to being again with us. Also, warm welcome to José Moises Martín Carretera, who has joined us from Spain. Thank you very much for coming. Also, thank you to François Gérolf for being with us here in this, to complement this panel. We also expected to have among us Katja Rietzler from Germany, but unfortunately she had to cancel at short notice due to illness. That's really a pity because I'm well aware that in this debate the German perspective would be very requested. But nevertheless, that's the situation. I hope perhaps some of the participants that will join us via video transmission could complement some elements of the German perspective to this subject. Thanks also to our colleagues from the OFCE for this new opportunity to organize this European debate. I think that it's very useful to have this setting of some different views from Europe, and for hosting again this meeting. I think it's not necessary to say too much about the subject. It's of course present to every one of you that inflation is back on the agenda all over in Europe. That's not absolutely new, but of course the war in Ukraine and the very hot and dry summer that we had have pushed the inflation back to the top of the political agendas in Europe. And as the inflation shock confronts many, and particularly low-income households with enormous economic problems, the fear of a loss of purchasing power has become a major concern among the population in Europe. So once again, after the COVID pandemic, large aid packages are needed to ease economic and social hardship. In this situation, of course, state interventions and subsidies are hardly questioned, but of course there are also concerns that these aid packages could come at the expense of sound finances or postpone necessary investments in the future, as well as the urgent ecological transformation. And finally, that's also from a German perspective important to mention, there is concern with regards to different capacities of the EU states to help their citizens and their economies. So I think solidarity is needed within the EU in response to these challenges posed by the inflation. And that's precisely why we are very happy to have this European exchange today. And thanks again for all of you for making it possible. And I hope also, as Xavier yet mentioned, that we will have again a very interesting and helpful debate and perhaps can define some common positions with regard to the challenges posed. Thanks again, and I hand over to our moderator, Céline Antonin.
Thank you. I'm delighted to moderate this debate on a hot topic, the comeback of inflation. So I had prepared a small introduction. I think I have a few minutes in order to open the debate and maybe to present also some of the issues which will be raised during this debate, and to give you some food for thought also. So first of all, I wanted to recall the context that gave rise to inflation. So as soon as 2021, after we entered the post-COVID period, and growth resumed, and so we had an imbalance between a rising demand on the one hand and an insufficient supply on the other hand, and this was particularly, we could see that especially on the oil market or the gas market, and this triggered an energy crisis. So this was combined with supply chain constraints, with the lockdown in China, with bottlenecks in production as well. So we had also an agricultural crisis with a bad harvest, so exceptional circumstances. And on top of that, we had the war in Ukraine, which added uncertainty and also supply shortages. So this was mainly this external shock, and now the fear is that it might become an internal shock with all the chain of consequences we could expect. So the experiences so far, we have this big reference of the oil shocks during the 70s, in fact, which are the big our big maybe reference on this issue of inflation. So we had during the 70s a period of stagflation with a combination of two phenomena that were previously thought to be incompatible, that is to say high inflation on the one hand and low economic growth on the other hand, which led to mass unemployment. So the idea is really to be able to curb this in order to prevent countries to know such to experience the same situation. So the shock was first treated as a demand shock, whereas it was a supply shock. So you have to clearly identify the kind of shock we were facing. And we had mainly a budgetary solution, so with a Keynes inspiration. And then you had some criticism of the Keynes theory, which took place, and consecration of Friedman's ideas and the triumph of the monetary solution. So we will see if this is the right solution. So this monetarist solution, with raising the Fed's key interest rates, stopped prices and wages to increase. So you had this kind of Reaganomics and all the policy, the supply side policy which took place and which curbed inflation, in fact, but with a high social price as well. So you have some similarities with this situation, but you have also differences. And leaders have built on this experience to design economic tools which were able to cope with the current crisis. And so the idea now is what to do in the short run and which policy mix should we have in order to curb inflation. So what we have been doing so far is restrictive monetary policy, the idea of having a restrictive monetary policy, but expansionary fiscal policy. So the restrictive monetary policy, to what extent should we have this? We still have negative real interest rates. So do we have to continue to raise the interest rates much higher? As regards the fiscal policy, we are having an expansionary fiscal policy which increases demand. So there is the issue of public debt, which arises in many countries. It has already increased much because of the COVID crisis. And so there is a different stance between Euro area countries. And this also reminds us of the sovereign crisis which took place in 2011. So how do we avoid such a crisis also? There are also social concerns, like you mentioned. It is legitimate to help households and firms, but which method is the less harmful as regards inflation? So do you have to subsidize households with checks or implement tariff shields? For how long? What kind of shields? For instance, we will come back on this. You have the difference between Germany and France as regards the tariff shields. You have the question of losing the price signal also. And when you don't have when you have a price signal, you have higher prices which change the structure of production by reducing the profitability of sectors that are heavy consumers of energy. But if you don't have this price signal anymore, this can be also preoccupying, and this can deter people from doing the right, from having the right behaviors. So the gradual change, for instance, in the policy mix, in the energy mix, is also a consequence of the structural increase in energy prices. So That will be questions that we will try to reply to. There is the question of the indexation of wages and the risk of having a price-wage spiral as well, especially since we see that core inflation has increased lately in the euro area. Is it a supply or a demand shock? If it is a supply shock, it has to be treated as such. So subsidizing households and firms is appropriate for a short-term shock. And on the optimistic stance, we could say that food prices will maybe recede and that supply chain constraints will be alleviated. But we could also have a pessimistic stance and say that what will happen if the shock on energy lasts, if it becomes structural. So we will need also a change in the energy policy, and we will need to rethink the energy mix in several countries. And for instance, in Germany, it implies changing also maybe the model, which was based on low-price gas, and especially from Russia, and also in Italy, which relies much on gas. So this implies thinking not only in the short run, but also in the long run. So I think that all these questions are really interesting, and I'm sure that we will come back on a few of them during the debate. So I'm happy now to give the floor to my colleague François Girolf, who will do a comparative look in the EU countries. So the floor is yours.
So thanks a lot, Céline, and thanks for having me. I have a few slides, but I'm not sure how. I hope I'm going to see from there, and you are going to be seeing. Okay. So like with Guillaume Allègre and Xavier Timbaud, we've been working on trying to investigate the social impacts of the war in Ukraine, like using mostly Eurostat data, like looking at differential inflation rates on different goods and how much each one of the quintiles in income consume of each one of these different goods, and trying to assess, you know, how much people are hurt by inflation depending on their income groups and depending on what they consume and depending also on what's the energy mix in different countries. So I don't know if you can. Oh, okay. So that's supposed to work, right? Okay. Okay. So I really can't see anything, and I hope you can. You see actually? Yes. So okay. Yeah, I can't. Okay. I'm going to be looking at it on my computer. But like, okay, so like, I mean, as Céline has said and has been said in the introduction, perhaps the most unusual thing that we've seen is like the huge increase in the price of natural gas. And perhaps since Céline has rightly made the comparison with the stagflation in the 70s and 80s, one big difference with the 70s and 80s is the behavior of natural gas. Natural gas is quite different from oil for the good reason that it's not completely a world market. And especially what's very unique in this crisis is that the EU is being hurt much more than the rest of the world, just because during the stagflation, obviously, the price of oil was increasing for everyone. So it was not an issue of competitiveness, for example, for the industry as much as it is this time around. And so I think that's one of the things perhaps that makes the response to this type of crisis even harder than it was during the stagflation. And as Céline has mentioned, basically there was a huge, you know, revamping of macro, like in the 70s and 80s, saying that all that we've done, you know, to fight against inflation, to try to respond to declines in economic growth was actually not working. That is, injecting more money or like spending more money through fiscal. And this time, in a sense, I mean, even though, as Céline has said, the usual traditional way of seeing that is that we were wrong to do all of this fiscal policy, that we should never have done that because it was a supply shock, and you don't respond to a supply shock by spending more money. It seems that this time we're doing exactly the same thing. So like the question is, why are we doing this? Is it that we are not learning from history, or is it that perhaps it was not that easy to respond to the stagflation? And, you know, my camp is more that maybe what we thought we had learned from the stagflation was not that, you know, it's easy to say afterwards that we did everything wrong and that we would have done it much better. But like this time, I think shows how hard it is to respond to a shock like this. And why is it hard? Because it's both. Perhaps there I would differ a bit with Céline. To me, it's both a demand and a supply shock. And we're going to focus mostly on the demand effects, that is the effects on purchasing power, the effect on inflation, which clearly hurts households. Like whatever you spend on gas and electricity, you cannot spend on other stuff, and so that's a big drag on the economy. It's not just that the price of oil is hurting companies, like declining margins and impeding you to invest. It's also that just when you spend a lot on oil and natural gas, you cannot spend on other stuff. And so it's also a demand shock. And that's the reason why governments are responding to a demand shock by trying to increase demand, or at least preventing demand from decreasing as much as it would if it didn't do anything. I think that's the main rationale behind the price shield that we're seeing and so on. It's not that the governments are stupid or that they didn't learn from the stagflation. It's more that it's very hard to respond to such a kind of shock without doing things like that. So I mean, of course, you know, if you compare with the, I don't know, where's the computer? There, right? Okay. So like, if you compare with what happened in the, what happened before. So if you look at the 70s and what happens right now, so one thing that makes it very hard to talk about is also the huge volatility. And like each time you say that the price of natural gas is historically high, then like the next day, and perhaps it's actually today, actually the price of natural gas becomes much lower, and we're not sure whether there's still a crisis and so on, whether there's going to be one down the line in the next winter. So like, let's assume, but that's part of the uncertainty, that we don't know how much that's going to last. And it's even worse for this crisis because clearly there's a geopolitical element to this, and we don't know when the war in Ukraine is going to end, how Russia is going to use energy as a weapon, continue to use energy as a weapon or not, and how much we're going to be able to store gas, and the storage is going to continue. So like that's the price of oil. That's just to show you that, I mean, if you look just historically, it looks like the increase in the price of oil is a bit less than it used to be, especially since in the last few weeks the price of oil has declined by a bit. But like, I mean, still, you know, it's not nothing even compared to the shocks in the 70s. And what makes it worse, as I said, for Europe is that now we have our own shock in the form of the price of natural gas that the US is not seeing. So this is quite inconvenient. There's something else, which is that actually the price, so the problem is that natural gas is used not just as material, but is used for energy. And so when the price of natural gas goes up, that tends to increase the price of other commodities which are substitutes in energy production, such as coal, for example, has increased in prices. And that's something, you know, that perhaps you would not have expected ex ante, that all of the sources of energy would become expensive at the same time. And this is, you know, this is being the case for, there's a lot of commodities actually that are increasing in prices, not just the price of oil and coal. So what we've done with Guillaume Allègre and Xavier Timbaud is to try and break down and use the household surveys in order to investigate by income quintiles what's the impact on households' budget of the increase, mostly in food prices and in energy prices. So we focus on food and energy because, you know, you have to stop somewhere in a sense, and the more you expand the scope, the more complicated it becomes. And you'll see that even there's a lot of things that you can say, and there's a lot of reasons to worry about heterogeneity in the Eurozone in particular, but in Europe more generally. So obviously the main source of heterogeneity is energy consumption and energy sources by European countries. You know, some European countries use a lot of natural gas for energy production, some use less. But like, regardless of what you use as natural gas, as you know, we have a common market for electricity and for like, well, I mean, it's a bit more complicated than that, but let's assume we have a common market for electricity. And so the market price of electricity becomes mainly the price of natural gas. But obviously, how much it costs to do, say, an energy shield depends on your energy production, because clearly, there are some infra-marginal rents if you have a lot of renewable energy. For example, your energy producers earn a lot of infra-marginal rents compared to the marginal cost of production coming from natural gas. So that's something you can tax, or you can force your energy producer to sell at a low price to your households, so it's less costly to intervene in that case than if, say, you have a major, than if natural gas is a major source of energy. And so, obviously it's very heterogeneous across Europe. As you know, Sweden, for example, is not using natural gas for heating anymore. I mean, almost not. It's using mostly the energy from the urban heating, I think you say. And so, clearly when you, and that's part of what makes the discussion also very hard, and very hard perhaps to act in concert at a European level, is that what you see as how much governments are giving in terms of subsidy, ideally you'd like it to be net of what the producers are actually earning. And it's not very easy to actually make that calculation, right? There's a huge incentive for government to say that they intervene a lot in the market, that they give huge subsidies to households, but it's very hard to compare across countries. And that's part of the reason why we look at inflation, which is supposed to look at all of this together, and supposed to, be a mix of what's your energy mix, but also the households, the government's intervention in the market, and how much it costs to intervene. So, like what we do in this paper, which is called SIWU, Social Impacts of the War in Ukraine, you can look it up if you're interested to look at at your own country, or like at some interactive data, or say if you don't want to start in February 2022, which we're going to do in this presentation, but start in October 2021, because that's when the price of natural gas starts to increase, actually. So it's unclear whether it's because Russia was sort of anticipating what was going on, whether there was some accelerated storage, or to the contrary, but still, it's very hard to know when to start. Should we start in September or October 2021? Here we're going to start right at the beginning of the war in Ukraine. That's when the major increase in prices takes place, and that's what we're going to do that. So what we do in this project is that we break down inflation into its different components by, so here we do 3-digit COICOPs, which are consumption by purpose. So I'm guessing that you cannot see much, perhaps even those who are very far from this, but at least people who are online can hopefully see that these are some bars. So the area of the bar, so on the x-axis you have the household share of the budget of each one of the items, and on the y-axis you have the inflation of that particular item. And so the area of each one of these bars corresponds to the contribution to inflation. Is the multiplication of the budget share multiplied by inflation, right? So if electricity is 1% of your budget and the price of electricity is plus 100%, then like the contribution will be 1% times 100%. Okay, and so it's a bit more complicated in practice, because the actually inflation is not arithmetic mean, but it's a geometric mean. But like, just aside from this complication, the sum of all these areas is the aggregate inflation, right? So the sum of all this, and so you can look at the contribution to inflation. So in gray, you can see the contribution of energy mostly, and each one of the gray bars correspond to either electricity, gas, and so on. You can see it for different countries. So I promise you, it's much easier to see on the website, especially as you hover with your mouse on each one of the items. You can look at how much it contributes, and what is the share, that is how much of inflation is coming from there. So these are the different countries. So I mean, obviously there's 27 countries. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's a second thing that we do and that you also can find on the website as well as on the Shiny app, which is to break down the changes in inflation for different types of households depending on their income quintiles. So here we have, I'm sorry, so I'm changing on the computer. Okay, so here is by income quintile. So the first quintile is the most poor of the households, and the fifth quintile, the most on the right, is the richest of the households. That's as a percentage of your revenue. Not of consumption, but of revenue. So obviously, you can see that inflation is always larger for the ones who are more poor. But of course, it depends. It depends on the country that you look at. In some countries, it's very regressive. In some other countries, it's less regressive. And so, of course, this multiplies, this compounds the effects of what the governments are doing in terms of the price shields. And also the energy mix. The more your energy mix is light on greenhouse gas, on natural gas, and oil, the easiest it is to intervene. Okay, so it's the multiplication of these two things. So I should rapidly conclude. Like this is the last graph. It's showing you for the 27 countries what are the different inflation rates. So the big, the shaded areas are the total inflation, and the ones which don't have anything in them is just inflation on energy and food. And so you can see that France is like at the bottom of this ranking, because France has been doing a lot of household price shields. Like there's basically almost no price signal left for Céline, so not much incentives actually to save gas. I kind of agree, perhaps that's a bit too much, especially since we need to save gas. And you can look at the different countries. So this is since September 2021. You can see that Estonia is right at the top of this ranking, and the ones in the blue, in the light blue, is the first quintile, and the one in the blue, I mean, how do you say? Navy blue. Navy blue is the fifth quintile. Okay, so. I mean, I'm sorry for having gone through this very quickly, but there's lots of information on that graph. Hopefully the flags help a little bit to sort through the mess. So thanks.
Thank you, François, for all these graphs and for the very interesting talks and for some replies. Maybe I will have the opportunity to reply just after.
Not supposed to reply as the moderator.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I will take a short time during the debate. So now I'm happy to welcome José Moisés Martín Carretero for Spain, who will tell us about the Spanish situation. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much for this invitation to this debate, which is quite interesting. And I would like also to share a couple of slides about the Spanish situation. So I don't know if we have it. Yeah? Okay, thank you. So the first thing I would like to share with you is what was the situation in Spain just before the war. No? So Spain was one of the Euro area countries most hit by the COVID crisis. Our recession, I think that it was the deepest in the European Union and in the Euro area. But despite this recession, the social policy made by the government maintained hundreds of thousands of employments during the crisis. It was for us, it was a great achievement, because you know that in Spain we are very sensitive to the GDP variations regarding to employment. So it was quite interesting. So we have good growth perspectives for 2022 and 2023, and the next generation started to develop, and we were in some way, quite optimistic about the future. No? But so the inflation started as we know in the last year, in the last part of the 2021. In this way, I fully agree with you that the COVID crisis was a supply and demand crisis, and 90% of the economic policy was aimed to the demand side and not to the supply side, and that was one of the reasons we are here at this moment. But at the end of the day, Spain is not too exposed to the Russian gas, and we have a quite interesting energy mix with a huge share of renewables. But despite this, the inflation peaked at 10% in July. At this moment, we're at 8.9%. In September, we're waiting for the data for October. And the expectation for the average of 2022 is around 8.7. This is a quite high inflation. Most relevant, I think this is quite more relevant is the core inflation. The core inflation is growing at this moment. Even if we reach the peak in the headline inflation, at this moment the core inflation is still growing. So the forecasts are that they are going to increase. So what were our main policy options? The government established three kinds of policy options. The first policy sets. The first one was the energy policies, second one is the industrial policies, and the third one is the social policies. The energy policies is quite famous at this moment in the European Union, which is the Iberian exception, which is the simplest and the most the more easiest way to understand is that we are capping the marginal cost of gas production in the electricity market, and that means that all the system is receiving a retribution which is much lower than the market itself. No? This is allowing to reduce notably the power price, but we have to understand that this is also this is changing the price signal of the electricity market now in Spain, and this is the trade-off we have to choose. We'll see in the conclusions. At this moment, this is working, but we are, in some way, changing the landscape of our energy market and the price signal that the energy market is sending to the people. This was the main policy, but we made other policies for the power savings plan, like the rest of the European Union countries. We established some kind of fiscal measures. I think this is quite controversial because we lowered the VAT for gas and electricity, just in order to keep the households being able to reach the consumption, and we established some kind of bonification of fuels. That means in oil and so on. We established also a social voucher for heating and electricity aimed for vulnerable families and households. This is as a summary, the energy policies. We have the industrial policy, was mainly support for most affected sectors, that means ground transportation, electro-intensive industries, agriculture and fisheries. But this is the core, but there is a lot of grants and a lot of loans to help these people to pass the crisis. And finally, we have the social and fiscal policies. We increased the minimum income scheme by 15%. We increased also the non-contributive pensions by 50%. This is related with the most vulnerable people. We established a grant of 200 euros for lower income households. And we agreed, this is for the next year, we agreed an income tax reduction for lowest incomes as well. On the other side, we created new taxes for energy firms and banking sector. These taxes are going to be effective next year, and a new temporary tax on high wealth households.
Just a question.
Yes.
Minimum income, it's minimum wage?
No, it's minimum income is minimum is like the basic income. It's okay. Like this. It's a.
So there is no impact on wages.
No. It's not impacting on wages. So, but the problem is that we have a very huge challenge on wages. So at this moment, the sorry, the overall wage increase by collective bargaining is 2.56%. That means that this is there is a huge loss of purchasing powers in the wages for most sectors. In the graphic, you can see this is from Oxford Economics. You can see the real wage growth under collective bargaining in Spain. That means that, yes, it's you can see that it's completely dropped in the last year. This is generating also an additional problem to the macro scenario, because if you don't have, this huge loss of purchasing power, the consumption is starting to be reduced, and that means that the demand is starting to be reduced. So we are in a very complex situation. We have all the elements is quite complex to understand. All these policies have had a quite interesting distributional effects. So you can see in the screen, this is from the Spanish Fiscal Authority, very recent report, that most of the benefit for these policies has been aimed to the first decile. That means that this is very focused on the most vulnerable people at relative terms. But if you look at the absolute terms, you can see that the cost of all these policies is quite equal, is quite horizontal. So, well, in any case, the policies are more focused on the lowest income deciles, but the problem that we have, and I think this is also, I don't know if this is for the rest of the European Union, but for sure this is for Spain, is that the loss of purchasing power is much higher than these policies. And if you have this loss of purchasing power all around the labor market, and you focus your attention in the lowest income sector, that means that the middle income is not receiving too much attention. And this has a very interesting, not only economic effect, which is the lack of demand, the problem with the demand, but it's a political effect, that the middle class is asking about what about them. So we have this problem, right? We have this problem. So what are our challenges with all these policies? These policies around 1% of GDP. All these policies, 1% of GDP. So, as you know, Spain has a weak fiscal framework with a high debt. And the problem is, how are we going to maintain this support over time? And this is one of my first reflections, maybe for the debate later, that these actions, these policies are, all of them, short-term policies, are not structural policies. It's quite difficult for a government to sustain these policies, even more if you have this weak fiscal framework. This is the first element I would like to share. The second element is that at the end of the day, all these policies are generating some kind of effects in the price formation over the time. So if you maintain these policies, as we did it in the 70s, as I fully agree with you, we are kicking the can around, kicking the can, and not solving the problem. And this is also more relevant in this moment of climate change strategies and energy transition strategies. So if you are subsidiating oil, you are subsidiating gas, you are subsidiating energy, is against all the things you made. You are supposed to do in order to accelerate the energy transition. And the final challenge is that at this moment the purchasing power is really the losses of purchasing power is really affecting, as I told you, the middle class, and that means that the growth expectation at medium term are affected for that. So this is the situation, as a conclusion for my intervention, I think that I am on time. As a conclusion for my intervention, and I think that the Spanish reaction was bold, but is a very temporary reaction. It's not a structural reaction, and we are waiting in order to know if the uncertainty of the geopolitical arena is going to be reduced or not. Because if we have to maintain this in the coming years, I think that we are losing our way. So, and this is the key element I would like to share with you. So, thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you. Thank you, Jose. So now I would like to maybe on Zoom, so to welcome Katia Ritzler, who is going to... No, okay.
It's not taking part. So.
Okay. So Andrea Boitani, who will tell us about the Italy case.
Yeah.
So please.
The consumer price index has moved since 2019. And of course, I mean, the very high red line is energy prices, while this declining black line, or sort of black line, is the communication prices. Okay, so they've gone down. And the index is equal to 100 in 2015. And the standard euro area graph for the contribution to inflation on the right-hand side. And you can see that, of course, energy and food have the largest share, particularly in recent months, even though the core inflation is going up as well. And this is, of course, I mean, through the standard input-output table. I mean, that's just the... And here is the graph as for consumer confidence in the euro area. And, well, it's quite telling. People apparently have the feeling that the next future is going to be bleak. And even though, I mean, you can see that disposable income has been rising up to the early months of 2022 and is now declining. And consumption, surprisingly, has recovered since the low in 2020, and even in 2021, 2022. Even though, I mean, the recovery is far, I mean, we haven't reached the level that we had in 2019. 2019. And here about, differences. Here we have Italy is the dark line, the euro area is the yellow line, and the shaded pink area is the difference. And you can see that as for the aggregate index of consumer prices, Italy, which had been more or less on line with the euro area, is now slightly above the euro area. But this is the left-hand panel is energy. Okay, so Italy is more affected by energy, while on the right-hand side you have the same index excluding unprocessed food and energy, and you can see that the inflation rate in Italy is slightly lower, and not that slightly than in the euro area average. The euro area average is around 6%, while in Italy is around 5%. Well, but there are, of course, problems that are looming. Right. Why? Because of the energy mix. And we have the energy intensity by source here as a consumption as a share of GDP, where, of course, the index of the EZ is equal to 100 in 2019. All the figures are for 2019. And as you can see, Italy has a larger share of gas than any other large country in Europe. And, a non-existent share of nuclear and a good share of renewables, probably the largest in Europe, but still a strong dependence on gas, of course. Whilst a slightly lower dependence on oil. That makes the consumer prices and, of course, even production prices more sensitive to the peak in the gas price. And as far as the production of energy from renewables, well, we can see that it increased in the euro area as a whole, as well as wind and particularly wind and solar, whilst in Italy, it's stalled. The yellow and red line. The geothermal is slightly more relevant in Italy than in the EZ average. But of course, Italy had a strong backdrop in the production from hydroelectric. And this is due to the droughts that we experienced in these, particularly in these years. And here, as for the impacts, well, here we have the household consumption deflator is the upper panel, and the household consumption that's the lower panel. And so the vertical axis figures are just percentage deviations from the baseline scenario. And the simulations are for a permanent one-shot 10% shock in the price of gas. Okay? And of course, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 are years. So suppose the price of gas increases by 10% in 2021. And what's the impact on the consumption deflator and on consumption? As you can see, the consumption deflator peaks after 4 years, whilst the household consumption declines over time up to the sixth year. And the overall impact on GDP would be sort of minus 3% by 2024. So the impact of this in energy inflation on consumption is quite substantial. And here is a graph which is sort of matches the one that José Martín showed us about the real wages and salaries per hour worked, which have gone down quite a bit since mid-2020. And all this information about real wages and consumption tell us that there is an impact of inflation on GDP, which is sometimes sort of hidden by the standard new Keynesian DSG model we were talking about with Javier before, because they don't have a proper role for the consumption. And therefore, I mean, the impact of inflation is just through the interest rates. So the only way that policymakers have to stabilize the economy is by raising the interest rate. Whilst, of course, I mean, here there is an inner stability of the model. If you have that part which is red circled, which is how inflation impacts on consumption. So that would reduce aggregate demand and stabilize inflation and output independently of monetary policy. So monetary policy would just add to that. And here is a very simple simulation of this. And you can see the adjustment path of inflation and output with a neutral monetary policy. And you can see that the inflation gap, which is due to an inflationary shock, will just fade away over time, as well as the output gap. So this is a model in which you have the famous divine coincidence of, and so that you are stabilizing output and stabilizing inflation at the same time. And here, I mean, stabilization comes not from monetary policy, but just from the reduction in aggregate demand due to lower real wages and lower real consumption. And here you can see the same simulation that gives the difference between the dynamic path of this economy if inflation is, as for inflation and output, if a monetary policy is added on top of the inner stability mechanism. So what you can see is that of course, I mean, if you add monetary policy, you have a faster convergence, and you have lower inflation, and but very much higher output gap for a long time. So this is just to add to the debate. We were saying, Céline and Francois and Martin said, should monetary policy be as contractionary as the standard view says it should be? That's a quite interesting question. It depends on the model you use. And finally, just the last point about the measures that have been taken, right? So here you have the distributive impact of the government measures which have been taken to cushion energy price increases. And as you can see, the red and orange bars are price increases and actually represent the impact of price increases on expenditures by decile. So on the left hand, you have the total all households. That's the first bar. And then the poorest towards the richest or the highest spending households. And the blue, dark and light blue bars are for the reduction in expenditures that are caused by the various measures, which are listed on the left-hand side of the slide. And more or less they're the same thing that were implemented in Spain. Tax relief, pension revaluation, bonuses, 200 euros, even exactly the same amount, and which was on top of another bonus of 150 euros, and a tariff component relief, and so on and so forth. As you can see, the impact, the distributive impact, was quite favorable in a sense. I mean, the poorest deciles, or the lowest expenditure deciles, were the most favored, and the actual combination of price increases and reliefs contributed to an increase in expenditure by 1.3%. This is expenditure with quantities unchanged. So it's just the price effect on expenditure, right? So it's a sort of last payer index, let's say, by design. So the relief was much lower for the highest deciles, and on average, this allowed an increase in expenditure by 3.7%, right? And I don't have simulations about the cost. Probably the cost is, I mean, I found your last slide very interesting, in which you said that the cost, despite the favorable effect on the income distribution or expenditure distribution, the cost was quite equally distributed. But because the highest consumers, of course, had the same sort of relief. But this result is because the energy has the higher share of expenditure among the lowest income deciles. And so what next? Well, I think that in the short run, this is what we should do. Reliefs. Probably this is something that I've just scratched, Well, if this is the price of gas going up, very up, and then probably at some time falling down, we should probably think of a smoothing of the dynamics of price. Because we do need, in the long run, a higher price of fossil energy sources. So probably this should, but of course, this sort of smoothing can only be done by governments. It's not the market. The market goes like this, okay? Up, and very down. We don't like the very ups because it's sort of disrupting our economic growth and has distributive effects and so on and so forth. And of course, but we don't want this, very deep downs, right? Because that would disrupt our climate change policy. So probably we should plan something like this. And of course, this implies some transfer of money, intergenerational transfer of money. Because now we are going to subsidize, and then we are going to tax future generations, or even our generations, if we last long enough. But I don't think there is another way out of this sort of policy mix in order to, let's say, reconcile the short-run needs and the long-run needs of the policy. And of course, then, if this is granted, then you may find the best mix between subsidies, rationing, monopsony power, as we were discussing at lunch, and as a consequence of monopsony power of the countries purchasing gas, and you may have a de facto cap on prices. Okay.
Thank you, Andrea, and thank you for the gas price trajectory. Now we know what to expect in the coming years.
No, well, that's just scrap paper.
Sometimes the best ideas come from scrapping. Yeah. So now I'm happy to.
At least I didn't write it on a
in a taxi,
in
like
a
the
taxi.
3%. Yeah.
or on just in a restaurant, a napkin, like laughter curve.
Same shape.
So now
Same
I'm happy to open the debate with Xavier Rago and Xavier Timbaud from the OFCE.
Thank you.
So how long do we have?
You have 45 minutes. Well, for the whole debate, but well, I mean, I'm. Yeah, but you can take a few minutes.
The net is the circle.
So there's an increase in in purchasing power.
This one, okay. So thanks a lot. I think it was very stimulating introductions. I will have maybe some couple of questions on the Spanish case, but it will not affect my general talk, which is, do you have an idea of the estimate of the cut of energy price, which is generated by the fact that you cut the link between energy price and the marginal price of producing, which is gas? An idea of the order of magnitude?
Yes, it depends because the price market is fluctuating, and this is quite stable, but it's around 30% of the total price.
30% of total price. Okay, thank you. So let me start then more generally. I think there are about this issue various aspects about fiscal policy generally, the use of public debt, monetary policy, redistributive policy, and energy policy, and which is a long-run mixed to reduce our CO2 emissions. And each policy has various time horizon, which creates a problem, as you rightly mentioned. So let me start with something. We spoke a lot about supply or demand shock. I think one key dimension is the persistence of the energy shock, which is at least as important as supply and demand. And energy is expected to be high for a long period of time because of the war, then it will not be a supply or demand shock, but for many countries it will be a negative wealth shock. A huge international transfer of resources from consumer to our producers. Producers are a couple of countries, but including the US, which will be more attractive with low energy price. So, and this negative wealth shock across countries will be very difficult to manage because you cannot create wealth with public debt or redistribution, things like that. So so the idea of the persistence of the price is key. If it's temporary, then what Andrea just said, I think is key. Even if it's a temporary increase in price and then it decreased toward a trend, and then we should smooth it, even if it's a supply shock. So the idea of the persistence is so difficult to assess. So in front of this uncertainty, what should we do? Too much or not enough? How should we be biased in front of using some fiscal tools or not? In my case, and I think many people are mostly in favor of using public debt to self-insure against the fact that the price might come down more rapidly than the high price for a long period of time. What we started to experience with a decrease in gas price recently because there are lots of speculation on this market. So I think there's a big case to be made in favor of smoothing this public debt with decent economic analysis for countries who have fiscal space. But having fiscal space is, for me, it's endogenous to the European coordination. If we want to have fiscal space in Europe, we will have fiscal space in Europe. We have to have an agreement with the ECB to avoid liquidity crisis. But all countries, including Italy, have some fiscal space. It depends on the ECB policy. So it's not like there are rooms to create some fiscal space with using ECB as a shield for, and look at the number we spoke about, 1 point of GDP for Spain. in France, it's roughly 1 point or 1.5 of GDP. If it's even 3 years of support, it's something like 5 points of GDP. We can absorb it as public debt if we even financing by pure public debt, even for Italy. It's possible if we have an agreement. So that's my first point. If we think that we need some fiscal space, I think we can try on the economic side to generate this fiscal space. On the political side, it will be tough. We know that because there will be some debate, and we'll be very happy to hear some alternative view saying that there's no fiscal space ever, things like that. That's my first point. Second point, I think that I will go to redistribution inequality in a second. I think that I'm not concerning monetary policy now. I think that monetary policy is not so conservative as when people think. As people have said, the textbook policy recommendation is that monetary policy should implement price stability. There are huge inflation, even core inflation. So there's no, the monetary policy is much more expansionary than the textbook implication because it allows for a lot of inflation and for some good reason. So although I think rates are increasing and they could increase at a lower rate, the real interest rate is so low today that I think there's a huge expansionary bias of the monetary policy. I will go for a smaller increase in interest rate, but it's a debate. I think that people focus on nominal rates, and I think we should put real rates in the debate, divided by the correct price index, which is core inflation, not HCCP. Core inflation, which is the price of VAT price dynamics in countries for firms and even for or wage inflation for household, but that's it. Third, I try to go fast. Concerning redistributive policy, I will not speak about it. I think Xavier has worked with Guillaume and François on that. He will be more relevant than me. A last point on changing behavior and dealing with the design of the fiscal support toward actors. So in France, we have decided to help mostly households, not a lot firms, to be within the framework of state aid, roughly, of the European Commission, things like that, and waiting for a kind of a European initiative for the supply side. Other countries have done a different choice. The UK have tried, but it's over. Germany have made a different choice, which is a kind of massive support to all firms. We can discuss about it. More than the heterogeneity that we discussed, creating some imbalance, possible imbalance in Europe, I think the design of the relevant tools is key. And I think that we discussed a lot of the fact that in France, and I speak about the macroeconomic side, not the redistributive side. Once again, I leave it for others. We have decided a tax shield to limit the increase in prices by 15% for all households. This costs a lot. It costs 2 points of GDP expected growth. So that's a lot of money. We don't have relevant tools which would be something more intelligent, more progressive, to provide a given amount of energy to low-income households and to reduce the subsidies to high-income households, taking care a little bit of heterogeneity across households, living in countryside, living things like that. And there's an idea which is a debate that we discussed in France and that is proposed in Germany, which is you subsidize energy linked to the previous consumption of energy. So 80% of previous consumption by household is subsidies at the market at a low price, and 20%, the rest and more if necessary, is on the market price, which is a non-linear pricing with a fixed amount of energy consumption subsidized by household. This idea has been done by Blanchard, Pisani in France, in Germany. But this is a good idea. And this is an excellent idea, both for the macroeconomic side, because it limits the cost, and for the redistributive side. In France, it has been said to be too difficult to implement. I really look forward to see if other countries will be able to implement it. Because maybe it was not so difficult, and we were kind of too fast in our... that's my point. They said they will. But many people, like in the COVID thing, they said many things and they did different things in Germany. And that's different. They say they will finance a lot, and actually the amount of money is much lower that is spent. In France, it's the contrary. We say we will finance a small amount and we finance much bigger. So it's a difference in culture. So I really look forward to see what will be the German implementation of this non-linear subsidy to household, which is the correct tool. So my last point is that there's monetary policy, fiscal policy, redistributive policy, and we need a better understanding of the proper tool to manage prices, to avoid brutal rationing, to be very generous in terms of using public money to subsidize everything, even rich household with big cars paying a low price for their oil. So we need to be smarter, and this kind of thinking about how to be smarter with macroeconomic shock and disruptive markets, I think is key to be able to implement the right long run and credible path for price for climate change, which is what everybody has in mind, the very long run. I think to be able to implement a very long run credible price signal. And when I say credible, is that because we tried with the Gilets jaunes something that was not implemented because of social problem. So be credible is to be smart enough to manage a redistributive thing. On this, I stop because I think Xavier will have many intelligent things to say about it.
Well, I'm not sure I'm going to say something very intelligent, but I will try my best. Well, we can look at the thing the way you've done, looking at policies and trying to find which policy is the good one for the problem at stake. We can also define what kind of goals we have in mind and see what is the best policy tool in order to fight. And it is important to look at the goals because it helps us to put the right diagnosis on what's occurring and what we should do. So first, if we think that we have a temporary price shock of energy, which is something we can say, and that is our problem, then we need to smooth over time this shock. Probably it's best to avoid inflation, or at least a process of inflation. This is to say when wages are going to catch up on prices, and that will ask for restrictive monetary policy, which is going to be very costly in terms of activity and future unemployment. So we may want to prevent that. And if we think that it is a rather temporary shock, then probably public debt is the best tool in order to smooth the thing. So you pay for price reduction, you even reduce the price of gas at the gas station. It's going to cost you a lot of money, but then in the future you're going to, like you were showing your graph, catch up prices slowly and avoiding the price inflation, the price wage spiral. So this is the first thing. The second thing you can now have in mind is you want to be fair in the impact of the shock. That is to say, you want to ensure that there will be no inequality. So you have the feeling that the shock is inequally striking people, depending on their income, depending on other things. You think that it is unfair, and then you want to solve this issue. If it is your goal, then public debt is not the good solution, because public debt is going just to push forward the question of how to solve this distributional question. The best thing to do is to say what Philippe Nain is saying. You give money to the more exposed or the poorest, and you take money to the less exposed or to the richest. So you increase taxes and you redistribute with some key in redistribution in order to solve the distributional problem that you have identified. Okay, that's one thing to do. But then public debt is not the question. Fiscal space is not the question. The real question is how you express your solidarity inside the country or between country using transfers, basically. And you have to be clear on the fact that it's going to be transfers because someone has to pay. Of course, you can gain a few months or a few quarters by solving the tax issue a little bit later, but one day or the other, it will come that way. Okay, but maybe we are not just facing an increase, a temporary increase in price, or a distributional question, and then maybe we have to think to the problem a little bit differently. So the first thing is we can, of course, refer to the climate change issue and say that it is only, it is not a temporary price increase, and it is a needed price increase. It's expressing the scarcity of fossil fuel, or the energy crisis to come, or the fact that we are ill-prepared to a substitution. And so then what we need to do is to increase the price signal and investment in the transition, which is a slightly different set of tools, because then we have to put that price signal over time to announce it and to form expectation about the price, and to accompany that with some investment and some policies. Well, you can discuss the validity of a price signal in that case and say that it is not possible to have a price signal because no one is ready and there is no alternative technological substitution possible at that moment. So what you have to do is to find a way to improve and to increase the quantity of technological substitutions which are available to people. And then you have a very complex set of public policy in order to do that. Okay, but I don't think that it is really the question at stake there. It's a very important question. It's going to be, of course, the main question of the next century. But this is not strictly the point which is taken there. The point taken there is that we are at war indirectly with Russia. And so we have to include that in our perspective. It's not only a temporary price increase, it's the price of energy and the price of gas is one weapon of a strange war. It's not the kind of war we have known during World War II. It's not exactly the kind of war we have known during the Cold War. It's, for us, a strange war where economic consequences are the way to put arm on a country. And we are using that weapon in reverse. That is to say, we want to impose sanctions on Russia and to put some pressure on Russia using economic weapons, because we don't want to fight directly Russia for many reasons, one of them being, of course, nuclear weapons. Okay, but if it is a weapon for a war, even if it is a strange war, then it means that we need to look at the problem differently. It may not be temporary. It may last a long time, because a war, we know when it starts, we don't know when it's going to end. And the position, the attitude you should have in a war is not to hope for a quick end of the war. You want your adversary to accept rapidly your conditions, but you don't want to say, I want this war ended by the end of the month. Because then if you do that, you're showing that you're not ready to do the war. And so you've already lost. So you can't say it's going to be temporary. So you need to say, I have a permanent solution to the problem, because I'm ready for a long-lasting war. And so if you put too much money, too much public debt there, it's going to be questionable at a certain point, because someone is going to say, yes, but you're not going to continue at this rhythm for a long time. And so I know when you're going to stop. Especially when the money you're putting in your public debt is exactly the money I'm cashing in terms of gas revenue. And so what is costing you is a positive wealth effect. Well, it's more complex than that, but it's a positive wealth effect for me. And so I'm going to accept your war quite easily, because it's a war which is more profitable to me than it is for you. So we need to address this question. And so in this framework, I think that the key question is the price of gas. Not only because the price of gas is what we pay, but this is also what Russia is going to receive. Either it is us, Europeans, that buy gas to Russia, or it is China who's going to buy gas to Russia. The magic of price is, of course, that the price is going to be nearly the same for everyone. And so if the price of gas stays high, even if we stop buying gas to Russia, Russia is going to sell gas at high price to China or to India. oil to China and India, and so we would have lost in that case. And so we need to find a way to decrease the price of gas or the price of oil. Well, the price of oil, this is precisely what the US has tried to do by a lot of diplomatic activity with some success, let's say. Yes.
Except, yeah, Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, but if you look at the price, I mean, diplomacy is something complex. So, but if you look at the price, too complex for economists. But if you look at the price, you can say that the price has decreased a little bit, and that's probably due to this diplomatic activity by the US. Then, what can we do on the price of gas? Well, we have discussed at lunch that, or at least Andrea was saying that it is impossible to put a price cap. I think it's not impossible. When you are in a war, everything is possible. It's not necessarily smart, it's not necessarily efficient, it's not necessarily fair, but in a war, everything is possible. But of course, you can say, if we put a price cap on gas, then we are at risk of a huge shortage of gas. That's true. But we are in a war, and we should accept some consequences. That could be one. Are we ready for that? Probably not. So maybe we have to be smarter than that, but at least this is a way that we could address this question. There are other ways to address this question. One of them is to play on demand. So Andrea at lunch was advocating for a gathering of all European countries into a monopsony. A monopsony which is able to say to everyone who provides gas in the world, Russia and other countries, we are a monopsony. We represent, I don't know, 20% of world demand in gas. And so if price is not as we wish, we are going to stop buying price, and gas is going to be zero. The price of gas is going to be zero because of excess capacity and so on. Okay, so we have a way to pressure and to discuss with gas suppliers. Maybe we can find an agreement and find a price at 75 euros per megawatt hour, the gas, and then that's it. We have played on the gas. Well, we could do that. We could also try to manage demand in Europe, which could be to impose, well, to ask for energy savings, or we can say that the situation is so preoccupying and worrying that we need to do some rationing on gas, and we are going to organize rationing in order to reduce demand. We can imagine to have a huge impact on the price of gas through storage, and probably this is what is happening today. So the price of gas is decreasing because there is high temperatures, but also because all the storage is full, and that probably some people are selling some gas in order to decrease the pressure and the ability of some suppliers to push price up. But we have to consider that every kind of tool we can use there has to be used. We, of course, need to build a strategy. Probably if we build the strategy all together, it's going to be more efficient. Probably if we discuss this strategy with our allies, especially the US, it's going also to be more efficient. It's going to be difficult because their interest is a little bit the reverse of ours. But, well, we are allies. We are not subjects of the US government. So we can discuss with them of some elements. I mean, the war is costing very much to them. So maybe their own interest is not to accept a too high price for a too long time. Well, maybe not, but nevertheless, we can play our game and our cards in that specific case and try to push down the price. I mean, we can't just react to a situation where we say the price is high and there is nothing we should do. Just adapt to that, try to limit the distributional effect, the monetary effect, the inflationary effect, because at one point we will wake up and say we were wrong not to consider rightly the situation as what it is, and it is a war, a strange war, a direct war, but this is a war, and we should play it as a war.
Thank you to both Xavier. And so I would like to open the debate now. Maybe a first reply by José Moises, and then Dominique Ruiz, who has asked for a question.
Okay, thank you. Quite interesting and open-minded, open-minded approach. So I think that if we are in war, everything is allowed. And this is clear. No, it's not only the price cap on gas. Is the monetary policy. Is the monetization of debt. Is everything is allowed in times of war. So the question is, are we in a real war? Are our societies ready for this or not? I don't know. We are repeating that we are in war, but it's like it's a very quite interesting way of being in war. The hours. So we don't know. So this is the first question, and the second question I think is quite interesting also regarding to the first intervention for Xavier as well, is the timing of our policy. The timing of our policy. We have to create a policy framework which is compatible, is making compatible the short term and the long term. And I don't know in the rest of the European Union, but at least in Spain, we are trying to insist that even in the short term, you can send signals to the long term through the phase out of these policies. So you can establish, we are in the short term, we have a shock, we have to react. In very short term, you don't have too much time to design good policies to be implemented. You have to go directly to the society. But you have to think also in the phase out. In my opinion, at this moment, I don't know in the rest of Europe, I don't know in the rest of the countries, we don't have a clear scenario to the phase out of these policies. And we know that these policies are counterproductive in the long term. We know that we need it in the short term. We know that they are counterproductive in the long term. But we don't have a phase out strategy. And I think that this is one of the key elements that we have to establish. It's okay to react in the short term, but you have to plan in some way some kind of phase out of these policies. And this is quite difficult to do.
Maybe I will give Dominique Ruiz, who wanted to ask a question, then François.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
Thank you. So François or Andrea, you want to react, maybe?
Well, of course, there are many issues that have been raised, and what I think is that, well, probably we don't know if we are facing a temporary or a permanent shock, and this just history will tell us what kind of shock is we have been experiencing. But however, I think that sooner or later the war will end, and Russia cannot afford to burn all of its gas, because that would be just not only a climatic disaster, but it will also be an economic disaster for Russia as well, if just stops selling the gas. And I don't think that purchases from China, from India's just close substitute for purchases from Europe. First of all, because gas has to be transported, and it's quite difficult to transport gas from Russia to China. But anyway, what I think is that if we want to have a smoothing of the energy price over time, back to the thing, smoothing, which means an increasing price over time, because we want to have the signal that energy from fossil sources is costly and will become more costly over time. So the price will increase. This is also a sort of assist to gas producers, because they know that their price will be higher in the future. Probably we will buy less gas in the future, but at a higher price. And but if we want to organize all this, which is a price cap after all, a dynamic price cap, we do need a monopoly power. I mean, imposing a price cap on a on a domestic market is relatively easy. The regulator says this is the dynamics of the price for energy or for whatever, and is calculated by RPI minus X or whatever more complex formula. But it's much more difficult on a free world market. So I think that we should abandon the free world market. Monopsony is not a free world market. It's a bargaining story. Okay, you have a bilateral monopoly, or more or less bilateral monopoly, or a bilateral oligopoly, let's say, and so it's a bargaining. Probably it's a bargaining which has a very strong political flavor. But you see, you said we are at war. And so, in a sense, the political bargaining is necessary, is typical of war times. I mean, at least if you want to have an end of the war sooner or later.
François, you
just to what Dominic said. Yes, I think that a European financial aid is a good idea, but only if in a framework in which European countries decide a common energy policy, not only just a sort of assisting or subsidizing countries for their temporary for their temporary needs in purchasing energy or gas in the first place at a lower price, or having the consumers and firms subsidize in the same way, which is relevant and important in the short run. But they should have a common energy policy, which is different from a common energy market, because in my view, we shall have a market again, probably in 5 to 10 years' time. But now we should have a political bargain. And the European Commission should have an energy policy and financial resources to support this energy policy.
Thank you. François, and then Guillaume.
Okay, it's just perhaps two clarification question on what you just said. You said we need to have like a monopsony to buy energy at a cheaper price, and we are in a weird war. But because I mean, the problem is that the allies that we have, like the US, want to sell the energy at a high price, right? If you think of LNG, and it's not very credible if you say we're just going to stop like buying gas. We need it more than they need to sell it to us. So how do we bargain in this situation, especially since we are not at war with them, to the contrary? And then the second question is, so yeah, I mean, perhaps this first question, but I mean, I'm not sure how you deal with that. Yeah, and the second question is, I mean, we all agree that if you have like a permanent, you're not going to respond the same way as a temporary, but it's so qualitative. I mean, as you said, the war is going to end sooner or later. So how do we say it's permanent? Like how many years before we say it's permanent? Like I think we have to be a bit quantitative, like if we want to know what to do at some point, because I mean, we all agree that we need to have a target of the carbon price that goes up and so on, but the orders of magnitude that we're seeing right now are just like an order of magnitude higher than that. So like, how do we smooth, and does it even have anything to do? So can we discuss that without being quantitative in a sense?
Yeah, of course, I mean, yes. I don't know if I can.
Yeah, maybe, and after Guillaume, or as you, yeah.
No, of course, I mean, in order to
yeah, you need
to gauge the derivative of this curve, you need some. In order to gauge the derivative of that curve, you have to be quantitative, and yes, of course, I mean, but forecasts about let's say the duration of wars is quite difficult, and forecasts are rather flimsy, but what I think is that yes, bargaining with allies has many dimensions. It's not just the price of gas, but just the cost of the war. So, I mean, I think that Europe has many arrows in it that can be used if it, so it moves at once. And of course, I mean, I think that the US is not interested. I mean, the US. I'm not saying the US gas producers, which is different. The US is not interested in having a Europe disrupted by the cost of the war.
Well, it depends on the midterm elections, right? I mean, the Republicans are. It's not very clear. Yeah.
Issues with German, I guess. Maybe Guillaume.
Yeah, I want to react to the fact that we are at war. I don't think we are completely at war yet, or completely aware that we are at war yet, because if we were completely aware, we would be discarding other priorities, and we will be reopening nuclear power plants much more quickly than we do now. We would be burning coal. We would be buying shale gas from the US at a much higher rate, and having terminal to have LNG gas come to the European market at a much higher rate also. So we would be discarding all our other goals in terms of climate change. And I think that it's still, this is a first step, like energy. It's considered like, okay, we have an energy crisis, but this is the first step in a much bigger energy crisis, which is climate change. And I think we're pretty much in this. We're not completely at war, otherwise we would be doing things very differently.
Yeah, Xavier.
Two remarks. First, I think, I don't know where to put between Guillaume and Xavier, but the first thing is that we should separate the issue of the price of gas and the second issue, which is the transfer toward Russia. What we want is to limit the transfer toward Russia. and there's a direct thing, which is an embargo on Russian import. And I recall, a couple of months we were speaking about it. Fortunately, Russia decided itself to reduce the volume, dividing countries among each other and playing countries against countries. But if we want to limit transfer, let's make an embargo on Russian export. And we will. It was a debate a couple of months ago. We would accept high price of gas as the cost of our commitment in this war. So the issue of how to limit transfer to Russia, which is definitely one goal, it's a complicated issue. I think there's an embargo. We've discussed with India, we have discussed with China. It's a geopolitical thing to reduce the transfer to Russia. And I think we should, if we want, it's a difficult topic. I think it's a difficult topic. But in this, I think, at least, and I think there's no opposition between many people here. I think the first step is indeed create an institution in Europe to bargain price at the world level, to create a monopsony, which, let's say, a coordination of the buying capacity of European countries. I think it's first step to affect the world price, to limit maybe the volume we want to buy to Russia, to reduce the price if we introduce a price cap. In any, I think, options, this is a necessary step, which is European coordination. So I think we can divide, you can discuss about tools, things like that, but I think we could agree on the fact that we need coordination in buying gas at the European level. It's the first answer of the debate about what should we do at the European level. Second, should we use public debt at the European level to help this? It's difficult. For me, it's difficult because there are two aspects. Either we issue European debt to help countries, or we create a shield on European debt to let each country issue its own public debt to do some design, the right moment, the right tools, at the right agenda to help the firm and household within the country with own public debt. Always the same debate. Either subsidiarity, which allows for more efficiency in the short run, or European coordination, which is much more powerful in terms of volume possible that you can issue, but it takes some time and coordination time, so that we see in the recovery fund that we have decided, there are lots of bargain about how to do things. So my small contribution to this is two things. I think we should definitely use this moment to issue public debt for necessary public investment, for interconnection of energy between France, Spain, and Italy, through even some transport, better transport coordination to allow CO2 emission, to reduce CO2 emission within Europe, for climate policies, which typically there are a lot of reports assessing public investment in each country to reduce CO2 emission. This type of emission could be financed by public debt, and I think this should be part of the change of European fiscal rules to allow this common public debt for this common good, which is a low carbon continent. So, but for the rest, I would say that we need, as a complement tool, some fiscal space for each country to be efficient in the coming quarters, years. I don't know, François, the timing of the crisis, but I think it's possible. And my last point on the exit strategy, I think it's a key point. My understanding is that indeed, any tools we implement during this crisis, we should think at the same time about the exit strategy. For the tax shield, my understanding is that in France, we allow for a tax shield, which is an increase in prices by 15% for all households. I think there's an exit strategy here, which is easy to think about, which is a progressive increase in energy price until we reach the market price. And I think that's things we should think about. And we need to forecast the energy price, we need to forecast the growth, and take the integral to have the fiscal cost. That's what is done today. But I think in many tools I see across countries, there are some aspect of exit strategy that I can think about. What is more difficult maybe is what Spain have done, which is to leave the electricity market. I don't know how easy it would be to re-enter it. Maybe it's part of it, but this aspect seems a little bit more difficult for me to understand.
Does anyone want to say something? Yeah.
I mean, I'm wondering how easy it is to do, I mean, to do what you said you would do as the elections are looming. Like you say, next year, the year after that, we're going to increase electricity prices by 15%. Perhaps you know, that's, you don't want to be that clear. So I think that's also a challenge for democracies. Perhaps it's much harder to, yeah.
Just to finish my explanation about the case of Spain, we have an horizon to finish this gas cap. My question today is that this horizon, time horizon, will be accomplished or not. Because maybe at the end of this period, we are going to ask for a new period, because we don't know. And that's for me, that's the problem with all these policies. But we don't know what time are we going to use them.
If there are no more remarks or questions, so thank you to all for your attendance, and thank you to the speakers. And goodbye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
It was the concluding remarks? That's the concluding remarks? No.
to add something?
No. Thomas always made a very deep remark at the end, so.
I will not dare to resume the debate. It has to be very complex. No. I will not be able to do it. But I think it was very interesting, some very interesting elements. I think this issue of whether we are in war, in hybrid war or not, is important to decide and to communicate.